As investors around the world fall out of love with technology stocks, at least in the stock markets, what's the future for Indian startups, founders, the IPO pipeline? And in the run-up to 1st of February, we are also asking this big question: is this the time for the Central Exchequer to even consider allowing direct overseas listing? That means new age companies listing on the NASDAQ, Hang Seng, Singapore, etc. That and more is what I'm going to be discussing with Sequoia Capital India's Managing Director Piyush Gupta, who's joining us all the way from Singapore live. Thank you, Piyush, for giving us this interview. I'll begin by first of all asking the big question everybody's trying to figure out. What's going on with consumer tech stocks, internet stocks? What has happened that they're falling out of love with what were clearly the darlings of the pandemic?
Thanks, Nayantara. Good to be here. So the first thing is that technology sector as a percentage of market cap in most of the major markets has continued to increase on a 5-year basis. We've had a very strong run for the last 2 years in capital markets. Very expected that the market volatility, will come through in some times, and when there is so much backdrop around the Fed raising interest rates and all the usual factors that we all know. Not totally unexpected. It's hard to predict these things, and the market could very well, be back up in a few quarters as the earnings come through strongly for many of the tech sector leaders.
Now, shareholder returns are, of course, so important, whether you are private or whether you are public. Back home right now, what we're seeing, of course, is a furor as consumer tech stocks recently listed are facing the global heat, right, as part of a global meltdown. I take that point. But Piyush, in the run-up to 1st of February, Union Budget, should Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman even consider direct overseas listing?
Nayantara, great question. I think it's a very structural question. Industry, the startups have been requesting for this for many years. The government has been working on it for a couple of years now. And so short-term changes in stock prices hopefully do not, shift the government's focus from structural reform and the ease of doing business. So our view remains the same, that it is a very important topic for founders who are building for the next 5 to 10 years. And if the markets came back 3 months later or 6 months later, it's not that a new budget should be called just to, focus on this issue. So it's been part of the package and under consideration by the government for a long time. And we hope that it actually gets done this time around.
I know, Piyush, everyone says you can't time the market. And I'm taking this conversation forward, keeping that in mind. So you're saying the government of India shouldn't be trying to time the market by allowing overseas listing. And, at the same time, a concern has been, shouldn't retail investors also participate in the wealth creation of Indian entrepreneurs and Indian startups?
I think, Nayantara, great question. I think this has been brought up a few times before. So the first thing is that most startups have very significant reasons and advantages for listing in the home market in any country. This is not unique to India. So what that means is that a good 75, 80%, 85% of all startups that are IPOable will choose to list in India. So it is not like, hey, the whole kind of parties run away and it's happening in New York or Singapore or Hong Kong or UK. That party remains in India. We are talking about very specific situations where founders of businesses may need the flexibility for business reasons, whether their customers are in the US or in Western markets, or they're building a global business which needs global talent and global M&A, or maybe they're from unique sectors like biotech or electric vehicles, which are very not well established in Indian market just yet. That's point number one. The point number two, I would say, is that when founders see that there's no path to an overseas listing, they may actually choose to list or incorporate overseas. In that case, India does not get the benefit of even seeing those companies, right? So it is actually working the reverse by taking away the choice, and founders are forced to make choices which are suboptimal from an India perspective. And let's not forget, Nayantara, that the Indian startups are now responsible for a very significant amount of employment generation. They are bringing productivity into the economy. We are bringing efficiency, whether it's in the B2B space, the B2C space. I mean, the technology adoption is so rapid from both consumers and now businesses that the role of startups in India, and I think as is well recognized by all of the key government leaders, is spectacular. And therefore, we should do everything to actually encourage capital formation. The US markets remain much larger than India. I'll just give you one stat. I mean, the India total capital market capitalization is about $3.5 trillion. In the US, that's more than $50 trillion. And while India had a great year last year, all IPOs put together raised $16 billion.
Can you explain to our viewers why this direct overseas listing should either be accompanied with a complementary dual listing in India, whether it happens immediately or a year or two down the line, or it should not make that mandatory?
They should not make it mandatory, Nayantara, because this comes down to technicals. I'll try to explain it in very simple. So let's say, dual listing works when the companies are very large market caps. There is enough trading liquidity to be split across two markets and still be okay. What does that mean? So let's take a company like, an Infosys, let's say, or any large company, $50-60 billion, $100 billion of market cap. And if you split that trading across two markets, it's still perfectly fine because the audience and the investor base for those two markets is quite distinct. Each market has its own trading dynamics, and that's fine. On the other hand, if you take a company which is worth, let's say, $2, $3, $4, $5 billion in market value, and you force them to list in India, then you're splitting the trading liquidity and maybe suboptimal for the company. That's one. Number two is different exchanges may have different requirements as far as M&A is concerned, or delistings are concerned. So unless there are very clear rules which say, okay, if your primary listing is in the UK or the US, you can do a secondary listing within X number of years, but it is not. But you will still get to follow the rules of your primary exchange. Okay, that's more straightforward. Otherwise the confusion around your reporting requirements, your governance requirements. So there must be very clear identification of that they can still follow the primary exchange requirements. And the India listing is simply for enabling retail trading. That said, there are enough apps and avenues today where retail investors can participate even in overseas stocks, not just Indian stocks, but any stock. And therefore, India is opening up quite nicely on that front as well. So I won't be so worried about India retail investor access.
Piyush, before I let you go, in the run-up to 1st of February, you've explained direct overseas listing to us and why it's so important, especially after a year which has been marked by not just a unicorn being minted every other day, record fundraising, but also the year of exits. That was 2021 for us. What can Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman do to unleash the animal spirits when it comes to startups? I think they're already unleashed, but let me just say unleash them further.
I think it's about ease of doing business, right? So this step is I would say that SEBI has made some very important changes to the listing regime to unleash, in the ease of doing business way, the startups to list in India. We need to see a similar action to enable global listings, whatever may be most appropriate for the company. I think that, while important in itself, is also a very important signaling from the government to the startup community that they're able to deliver on what the startup community has been expecting to come for the last 18, 24 months.
Okay, so let's see how we do see any simplification as far as ease of doing business goes. Talent is, of course, the other big crunch that we're seeing, not just as new economy suffer from, but even the old economy with Elon Musk also tweeting expectations are running high. Maybe we'll see some breaks when it comes to ESOPs, the startup currency. Piyush, Thank you so much for taking the time out, being so candid with us, and giving this very, very timely interview to ET Now.
Thank you, Nayantara. We are holding our breath and crossing our fingers.